Case 1, Mark Burned. On the warm morning of February 1, 2012, inside a quiet elementary school in South Los Angeles, California, parents dropped their children off with the same comfort they had felt for years. Backpacks bounced down the hallway. Lunchboxes clattered onto desks. A bell rang, signaling another ordinary school day. Inside room 18 at Miramonte Elementary School, a veteran teacher named Mark Burned prepared his classroom like he had done for decades. Posters lined the walls. Crayons sat neatly in bins. A trusted authority figure stood smiling at the doorway, greeting young students by name. But behind that calm routine, something deeply disturbing was already unfolding. Mark Burned had spent nearly 30 years teaching elementary students. To administrators, he was reliable. To parents, he was experienced. To children, he was simply Mr. Burned, the man who taught them to read, write, and raise their hands before speaking. No one imagined that the same classroom designed to protect innocence was slowly becoming a place of hidden trauma. The first cracks in the illusion didn't come from a confession or a witness. They came from medical concern. Several students began reporting strange symptoms after school days in Burned's class. Parents noticed unexplained irritation around their children's mouths and faces. Doctors were puzzled. School nurses documented complaints. At first, no one connected the dots. Childhood illnesses happen. Kids touch everything. Teachers handle dozens of students every day. It all seemed harmless. Until the pattern refused to disappear. School officials quietly began asking questions. Administrators observed Burned's classroom more closely. And that was when subtle behaviors raised quiet alarms. He often isolated students for special help. He used tissues excessively. He insisted on handling minor issues personally rather than sending children to the nurse. None of these behaviors alone proved anything. But together, they formed an uneasy picture that no one wanted to believe. The truth finally surfaced when investigators interviewed students with trained child specialists present. What emerged was chilling. Children described acts no child should ever experience inside a classroom. They spoke about inappropriate contact, disturbing behaviors, and moments that confused and frightened them but felt impossible to explain at the time. Their words were hesitant, fragmented, but consistent. What made the allegations even more horrifying was the method. Burned was accused of deliberately exposing students to bodily fluids, acts that crossed every boundary of trust and safety. The allegations suggested repeated behavior over time, not a single lapse in judgment. Investigators realized they weren't dealing with a misunderstanding. They were confronting a predator hiding in plain sight. Parents were blindsided. The school community erupted in shock, anger, and disbelief. How could something like this happen inside a public school? How could a teacher with decades of service be capable of such behavior without anyone stopping it sooner? The story quickly spread across Los Angeles. News vans lined the school entrance. Cameras pointed at the classroom windows where children once learned multiplication tables and spelling words. For families, the building no longer represented education. It represented betrayal. Burned was placed on leave as investigators moved quickly. Detectives reviewed student statements, medical records, and staff observations. What they found suggested a pattern that could not be ignored. Each new interview added weight. Each parent realized the nightmare wasn't isolated, multiple families were affected. But the most disturbing question remained unanswered. How long had this been happening, and how many children were silently carrying memories they didn't yet understand? As prosecutors prepared their case, the community braced for the reality that justice would not erase what had already been done. The classroom had changed forever. The trust between families and institutions had been shaken. And the man who once stood as a protector of children now faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Yet even as the evidence stacked against him, one final twist would deepen the shock even further, revealing how the system itself had unknowingly allowed the danger to continue. And that discovery would ignite national outrage. As the investigation into Mark Burned intensified in early 2012, something even more unsettling surfaced, evidence that warning signs may have been overlooked long before police ever stepped into the classroom. Former staff members began speaking quietly. Some admitted they had noticed unusual behavior over the years but never imagined it could be criminal. Others said complaints had been raised but were handled internally without escalating to law enforcement. In a system designed to protect children, hesitation and bureaucracy had quietly created space for harm to continue. The realization devastated parents. Many families began asking the same painful question: if someone had acted sooner, could their children have been spared? The case expanded rapidly. Prosecutors reviewed dozens of student interviews. Medical experts confirmed that the symptoms described by parents aligned with the alleged acts. The consistency between testimony strengthened the case. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't exaggeration. It was a documented pattern of abuse committed inside a public school classroom. Berndt was arrested and charged with multiple felony counts involving lewd acts with minors. The charges reflected not just one incident, but a series of repeated violations spanning months, possibly longer. Facing overwhelming evidence and public outrage, Berndt eventually entered a plea rather than forcing young victims to testify in open court. In 2013, the courtroom fell silent as sentencing approached. Families filled the benches. Some parents clutched photographs of their children. Others stared directly at the man who had once taught their sons and daughters how to write their names. Victim impact statements described confusion, fear, anxiety, and trust issues that lingered long after the classroom doors closed. The judge sentenced Mark Berndt to 25 years in state prison. For many families, the sentence brought a sense of accountability, but not closure. No number of years could undo what had already been done. Childhood memories had been altered permanently. Innocence had been compromised by someone entrusted with shaping young minds. The case triggered massive reform discussions across Los Angeles and beyond. School districts re-evaluated reporting procedures, supervision policies, and staff accountability systems. Mandatory reporting protocols tightened. Background checks were scrutinized. Training programs were updated. The system had learned the hard way that silence can be just as dangerous as action. But beneath the policy changes remained a deeper truth. Predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear name badges. Sometimes they hand out homework assignments. Sometimes they smile at parents during pickup hours. And sometimes, the danger exists quietly, hidden behind routines so familiar that no one questions them until it's too late. Mark Berndt's classroom became a symbol of how easily trust can be manipulated when authority goes unquestioned. His case serves as a reminder that vigilance must never disappear simply because someone holds a respected title. Case 2, Joseph R. Gutowski. On a quiet afternoon in October 2018, inside a suburban neighborhood near St. Louis County, Missouri, parents believed their children were safe behind familiar school walls. Hallways echoed with lockers slamming shut. After-school practices wrapped up. Teachers graded papers in empty classrooms. Nothing about the day hinted that a deeply hidden surveillance network had already been operating in the shadows. At the center of it all was a longtime educator named Joseph R. Gutowski. Gutowski worked within school facilities where students trusted adults to protect their privacy, locker rooms, classrooms, and private changing spaces. To colleagues, he appeared unremarkable. Quiet. Reliable. Professional. The kind of staff member who avoided attention and rarely caused problems. That invisibility became his shield. What no one realized was that Gutowski had quietly transformed ordinary spaces into observation points. Hidden cameras were discovered inside areas where students should have felt completely safe from intrusion. Tiny devices concealed in everyday objects recorded footage without consent, capturing private moments that were never meant to be seen by anyone else. The recordings weren't accidental. They were deliberate. Carefully placed. Maintained over time. The discovery didn't come from a student complaint. It came from a digital trail. Federal investigators monitoring online networks tied to illegal material detected uploads that traced back to Gutowski. The content matched footage captured inside school facilities. As authorities followed the trail, they realized the recordings weren't coming from a distant server or foreign website. They were originating from a trusted American school employee. When agents executed a search warrant at Gutowski's residence, they uncovered storage devices containing hundreds of illicit files. Some were downloaded. Others were produced locally, footage that matched locations inside the school environment. The cameras themselves were recovered, along with mounting equipment and data cards. The realization sent shockwaves through the community. Parents struggled to comprehend how long the cameras had been operating. Students questioned whether their privacy had ever existed. School administrators scrambled to determine how security protocols had failed so completely. Every hallway suddenly felt suspicious. Every ceiling corner felt watched. Investigators pieced together Gutowski's timeline. They learned he had been collecting material for an extended period, carefully managing his devices and transferring footage off-site to avoid detection. He didn't act impulsively. He planned. He adjusted angles. He monitored battery life. He retrieved memory cards like routine maintenance. This wasn't curiosity. It was obsession. Federal charges soon followed. Gutowski was charged with production and possession of child sexual exploitation material, crimes that carry severe mandatory prison sentences. Prosecutors emphasized that the violation wasn't just digital, it was psychological. Students had unknowingly been recorded during vulnerable moments, their privacy permanently stolen. As the case moved toward court, families demanded answers that could never fully arrive. How many victims were there? How much footage existed? Had the cameras ever been discovered earlier? How could someone operate in plain sight without suspicion for so long? But the most unsettling part wasn't the technology. It was the trust. A trusted school employee had turned everyday spaces into silent surveillance chambers, transforming safety into exposure without a single victim realizing it until after the damage was already done. And as the evidence mounted, the courtroom prepared to confront a crime that blurred the line between physical presence and digital exploitation, a betrayal that followed students long after the school bell rang. Yet the sentencing phase would reveal just how seriously the justice system viewed this silent form of abuse. In federal court, prosecutors laid out the scale of Joseph Gutowski's operation. Digital forensic experts testified about the recovered files, the metadata connecting footage to school locations, and the methods used to distribute or store the material. Each technical detail painted a clearer picture of intentional exploitation rather than accidental possession. The defense offered little room for explanation. The evidence was overwhelming. The cameras had been deliberately hidden. The recordings were categorized. The timestamps aligned with Gutowski's access to the facilities. There was no plausible misunderstanding. Gutowski ultimately entered a guilty plea. In 2020, the judge sentenced him to approximately 20 years in federal prison, followed by long-term supervised release and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The sentence reflected both the number of victims involved and the calculated nature of the crimes. For many families, the punishment felt heavy, yet still insufficient. No sentence could undo the anxiety that followed the revelation. Parents questioned whether their children had been among those recorded. Students wrestled with the idea that their private moments may exist forever on digital storage somewhere in the evidence vault. Schools responded with sweeping changes. Facility inspections increased. Camera detection sweeps became routine. Staff access protocols tightened. Cyber monitoring expanded. The invisible threat had forced visible reform. But beneath the policy updates remained a deeper wound, the loss of safety in places that once felt predictable. The Gutowski case demonstrated how modern exploitation no longer requires physical contact to cause lasting harm. A hidden lens can invade privacy just as deeply as a locked door. The violation travels beyond walls, beyond years, and into adulthood for victims who must live knowing their vulnerability was recorded without consent. It also exposed how predators evolve with technology. They learn new methods. They hide behind digital complexity. They exploit systems that lag behind innovation. And often, they operate quietly, not through chaos, but through patience. Gutowski's downfall came not because someone noticed a strange device in a ceiling tile, but because digital monitoring finally connected invisible dots. A reminder that even hidden crimes leave traces. Yet even with justice served, the emotional damage lingered. Students returned to classrooms that felt unfamiliar. Parents approached school environments with new skepticism. Administrators confronted the uncomfortable reality that trust alone cannot replace accountability. And as disturbing as this case was, it represents only one form of institutional betrayal. In the next story, the corruption does not hide behind cameras, it hides behind charisma. A teacher whose charm built emotional dependence. A boundary crossed slowly, quietly, until manipulation felt like affection. A relationship that should never have existed. And a crime that would permanently alter a young life. Case 3, Sean David Sigler. On a bright afternoon in May 2016, the quiet residential streets of Burbank, California felt no different than any other school day. Parents waited in car lines. Students laughed as they poured out of classrooms. Teachers locked doors and headed home after another routine shift. Inside one of the city's elementary schools, a former educator named Sean David Sigler still carried the reputation of being approachable, supportive, and deeply invested in student success. To many families, Sigler had once been exactly what parents hope for in a teacher: patient, encouraging, and willing to give extra time to struggling students. He volunteered for tutoring sessions. He answered emails late at night. He built rapport easily with children who craved attention and validation. That closeness, however, would slowly transform into something dangerous. The relationship that triggered the investigation didn't begin with alarms. It began with messages. What started as friendly communication between Sigler and a former student gradually became more personal. Compliments turned into emotional reliance. Conversations shifted from school topics to private life discussions. Boundaries blurred so slowly that neither the student nor surrounding adults immediately recognized the danger unfolding. This gradual progression is exactly how grooming often works, building trust before crossing lines. Over time, communication moved into private channels. Images were exchanged. Explicit requests followed. Authorities later determined that Sigler had coerced the minor into creating and sending explicit material he stored and shared digitally. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was cultivated. The investigation unfolded after suspicious activity was flagged online and reported to authorities. Digital forensic teams traced the accounts back to Sigler. Search warrants revealed devices containing illegal material linked directly to the former student. Metadata confirmed timelines, locations, and patterns that eliminated any claim of misunderstanding. Federal agents arrested Sigler and charged him with production of child sexual exploitation material, among other serious offenses. Prosecutors emphasized the imbalance of power, an adult educator exploiting a student's trust, admiration, and emotional vulnerability. The victim, now forced into adulthood with trauma shaped by manipulation rather than safety, faced the lifelong consequences of that betrayal. In court filings, investigators outlined how Sigler had maintained careful secrecy, often communicating late at night, encouraging deletion of messages, and reinforcing emotional dependency. He didn't rely on force. He relied on influence. That distinction matters, because influence can feel like affection when viewed from the inside. Parents in the community struggled with disbelief. How could someone who once helped children learn and grow deliberately exploit the same trust? How many warning signs had been invisible? Could earlier intervention have prevented the escalation? As the case moved forward, the narrative became painfully clear. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern of calculated manipulation designed to maintain control while avoiding detection. And when the digital evidence became undeniable, Sigler faced the reality that his actions would follow him for the rest of his life, through courtrooms, registries, and prison walls. But sentencing would reveal just how severe the consequences would be when the justice system weighed the psychological harm inflicted on a child. Inside the federal courtroom, prosecutors presented a detailed timeline built entirely from data, timestamps, message logs, recovered files, device histories, and account activity. Every click left a trace. Every deleted file left fragments. Every attempt to conceal only strengthened the forensic picture. The evidence showed a deliberate effort to groom, manipulate, and exploit. Sigler's defense offered limited resistance. The digital footprint was overwhelming. Devices seized from his residence contained explicit material tied directly to the minor victim. Cloud backups confirmed long-term storage. Communication records showed sustained interaction rather than isolated incidents. Faced with the reality of the evidence, Sigler ultimately entered a guilty plea. In 2018, the judge sentenced Sean David Sigler to approximately 30 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The sentence reflected the severity of exploiting a minor through production crimes, among the most serious charges in federal law. The courtroom was quiet as the sentence was read. For the victim's family, the punishment provided accountability but could never restore what had been taken: trust, safety, emotional stability. The scars of manipulation often emerge later in life, shaping relationships, confidence, and self-worth in ways that are difficult to heal. The case sent a message far beyond Burbank. Educators across the country revisited digital communication policies. Schools tightened restrictions on staff messaging with students. Parents became more vigilant about online activity. Awareness campaigns emphasized grooming patterns and emotional red flags. Yet even with reforms, the damage had already been done for one young person whose admiration had been weaponized. Sigler's story illustrates how predators no longer rely on physical proximity alone. Phones, apps, and private messaging platforms create invisible pathways that bypass supervision. Manipulation can happen silently, behind screens, in moments no one else witnesses. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the victim often believes they are participating willingly, unaware of how power dynamics distort consent. That psychological trap is what makes these crimes so devastating. As Sigler began serving his sentence, his former classroom identity dissolved completely. He was no longer a teacher. No longer a mentor. He became another federal inmate number, defined not by lesson plans, but by irreversible harm. Yet this case represents only one way authority can be abused. In the next story, the betrayal moves away from digital grooming and into direct physical manipulation, involving a staff member who used proximity, trust, and access to cross boundaries inside a school environment itself. A different method. A different predator. The same shattered innocence. Case 4, Paul Gia. On a cold evening in November 2014, deep in the quiet hills near Hancock, New York, snow dusted the long gravel driveways leading to a remote boarding school known as the Family Foundation School. The campus promised structure, discipline, and recovery for troubled teenagers. Parents sent their children here believing it was a place of healing, a controlled environment where young people could rebuild broken paths. Inside the walls of this isolated school worked a trusted instructor and choir director named Paul Gia. Gia was charismatic. He led music programs, organized performances, and positioned himself as a mentor to emotionally vulnerable students. In a setting where teens were separated from families and outside oversight was limited, authority carried enormous weight. Students depended on staff not only for education, but for stability, approval, and connection. That dependency became Gia's leverage. Federal investigators later determined that Gia exploited students who were already struggling, adolescents seeking validation, guidance, and escape from difficult pasts. What began as emotional bonding gradually crossed into manipulation and coercion. Students were isolated. Boundaries blurred under the guise of mentorship. Private conversations replaced supervised interaction. Over time, the situation escalated into sexual exploitation. Investigators uncovered evidence that Gia transported minors across state lines for illicit purposes, a federal crime that elevated the case beyond local jurisdiction. The crimes were not spontaneous. They were organized, repeated, and hidden beneath layers of institutional silence. What made the case even more troubling was the environment itself. The boarding school's isolation created a perfect storm: limited external supervision, vulnerable youth populations, and deep trust placed in staff members. Students often hesitated to report misconduct, fearing retaliation, disbelief, or punishment. Some believed the behavior was part of discipline or mentorship. Others felt trapped. The silence lasted far too long. When federal authorities finally intervened, the investigation revealed a pattern of abuse that spanned years. Multiple victims came forward. Their stories aligned in disturbing ways: similar manipulation tactics, similar isolation methods, similar emotional pressure. Each account reinforced the credibility of the next. Parents who had entrusted the school with their children felt betrayed not only by Gia, but by the system that allowed him to operate without accountability. Lawsuits followed. Media scrutiny intensified. Former students spoke publicly about trauma they had carried quietly into adulthood. Gia was arrested and charged with multiple federal counts, including transportation of minors for illegal sexual activity and exploitation-related offenses. The severity of the charges reflected the systematic nature of the abuse. As the case moved towards sentencing, the scope of the betrayal became undeniable. This wasn't one student. It wasn't one moment. It was a pattern built on silence, authority, and isolation. Yet even with overwhelming evidence, many victims still wrestled with conflicting emotions: guilt, confusion, loyalty, anger. When abuse occurs inside institutions that claim to protect, the emotional damage cuts deeper than physical harm. The question haunting families remained painfully simple: how many young lives had been altered before anyone finally listened? In federal court, prosecutors presented testimony from multiple former students whose accounts mirrored one another in unsettling detail. Digital records, travel documentation, witness statements, and corroborating evidence established a consistent pattern of exploitation that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Gia faced the reality of federal sentencing guidelines, decades behind bars. Rather than forcing victims to endure prolonged testimony, Gia entered a guilty plea. The court weighed the severity of transporting minors, abuse of authority, and long-term psychological damage inflicted on victims who had already entered the school seeking stability. In 2016, Paul Gia was sentenced to approximately 327 months in federal prison, more than 27 years behind bars, followed by supervised release and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The sentence sent a clear message: institutions that exploit isolation and authority will face extreme consequences. But for survivors, justice was only partial relief. Many spoke about lingering trauma, difficulty trusting authority figures, challenges forming relationships, recurring anxiety, and unresolved anger. Some struggled with the guilt of not reporting sooner, even though they had been manipulated into silence. The boarding school itself faced intense scrutiny. Investigations exposed failures in oversight, reporting mechanisms, and staff supervision. Lawsuits forced structural reforms. The case became a national example of how vulnerable youth populations require heightened safeguards, not isolation. Parents across the country began questioning residential programs more critically. Transparency became a demand rather than a luxury. Accountability replaced blind trust. Yet the deepest damage remained invisible. When abuse happens in controlled environments where escape feels impossible, the psychological scars often outlast the physical evidence. Survivors carry the memory of powerlessness long after institutions close their doors. Gia's downfall exposed not only individual wrongdoing, but systemic weakness, how silence can become a shield for predators when oversight disappears. His once celebrated role as mentor and choir director collapsed into a permanent criminal record and decades of incarceration. But the legacy of harm would remain embedded in the lives of those he manipulated. And while this case unfolded in isolation, the next story moves into a public school environment, where a trusted staff member abused access not through emotional grooming, but through direct physical proximity and authority. A different setting. A different technique. The same devastating betrayal. Case 5, Matthew Christopher Yates, St. On a humid afternoon in August 2019, the narrow roads winding through St. Johns County, Florida, shimmered beneath the late summer heat. School buildings stood quiet between sessions. Hallways waited for the return of students. In the rural community near Hastings, parents trusted that their children's classrooms remained places of structure, safety, and supervision. One of those classrooms once belonged to a middle school teacher named Matthew Christopher Yates. Yates taught 8th grade students, teenagers caught between childhood and independence, still learning how to recognize danger, still trusting adults in positions of authority. To colleagues, he appeared committed and engaged. To students, he was familiar and approachable. Nothing in his public behavior signaled the private intentions investigators would later uncover. The case did not begin with a victim stepping forward. It began with digital monitoring. Federal investigators tracking online activity related to exploitation detected suspicious communications linked to Yates. The messages suggested intent, explicit language, inappropriate exchanges, and attempts to arrange meetings with a minor. The digital trail quietly built a profile long before anyone inside the school system became aware. Undercover agents assumed the identity of a minor online and engaged Yates in conversation. What unfolded shocked even seasoned investigators. He allegedly sent explicit messages, requested images, and discussed meeting in person for sexual activity. The conversations escalated rapidly, showing a willingness to cross boundaries without hesitation. This wasn't curiosity. It was pursuit. Agents arranged a controlled meeting. When Yates arrived at the designated location expecting to meet a minor, federal officers arrested him on the spot. The illusion of professionalism collapsed instantly. The man entrusted with shaping young minds now faced serious federal charges. Search warrants executed at his residence uncovered electronic devices containing explicit material and evidence supporting the undercover communications. Digital forensic analysis confirmed intent, patterns, and planning. Parents in the community felt blindsided. How could someone who stood in front of students every day harbor such hidden behavior? How many warning signs had gone unnoticed? Could anyone have predicted this? The charges against Yates included enticement of a minor and exploitation-related offenses, crimes that carry long mandatory sentences due to the potential harm inflicted on children. What made the case especially disturbing was the proximity factor. Unlike online-only predators, Yates had daily access to students. The boundary between digital intent and real-world opportunity was dangerously thin. Prosecutors emphasized that the crime was stopped before physical harm occurred, but the intent itself represented a serious threat. Prevention, in this case, may have saved a child from irreversible trauma. Still, the emotional impact rippled outward. Students questioned whether they had ever been at risk. Parents re-examined every interaction, every classroom meeting, every casual conversation. Trust fractured quietly. As the case moved toward court, Yates' digital footprint left little room for defense. The evidence didn't rely on hearsay. It relied on messages, timestamps, images, and recorded exchanges. Technology had captured the intent before the harm could escalate, a rare reversal in cases where predators often remain hidden until damage is already done. But sentencing would reveal the true weight of accountability. In federal court, prosecutors presented a chronological reconstruction of Matthew Yates' communications. Jurors and the judge reviewed transcripts of explicit messages, plans to meet, and confirmation of identity. The clarity of the digital evidence made denial nearly impossible. Yates ultimately entered a guilty plea. In 2021, he was sentenced to approximately 15 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and mandatory sex offender registration. The court emphasized deterrence, public safety, and the importance of early intervention in digital exploitation cases. For the community, the sentence brought relief, but also lingering unease. The case forced parents and educators to confront uncomfortable realities about online environments, even among trusted professionals. Digital platforms allow predatory behavior to flourish quietly until law enforcement intercepts the pattern. Schools responded with renewed training programs, stricter monitoring of staff conduct, and clearer reporting channels for suspicious behavior. Digital safety education expanded beyond students to include staff accountability. But no policy could fully restore what had been shaken. The idea that a trusted teacher could actively pursue minors outside the classroom left families questioning how well they truly knew the adults guiding their children. It challenged assumptions about appearances, credentials, and reputation. Yates' story stands as a reminder that intent matters just as much as action. Predators often escalate gradually. Stopping them early can prevent lives from being permanently altered, but it requires vigilance, technology, and decisive intervention. Yet while this case involved online pursuit and intercepted intent, the next story moves into a different territory altogether. A staff member whose crimes extended beyond messages and surveillance into long-term physical exploitation across multiple victims. A case that shattered a community. A sentence that shocked the courtroom. And a betrayal that spanned years before the truth finally emerged. Case 6, Koi Kapahulehua. On a blazing afternoon in June 2017, the desert heat hovered over the neighborhood surrounding Mesa, Arizona. Summer break had entered the classrooms. Football fields sat silent. Lockers stood open, waiting for the next school year. For many families, the pause felt safe, a temporary escape from academic pressure and daily routines. But for investigators, the quiet masked years of buried secrets. At the center of the unfolding case was a longtime educator named Koi Kapahulehua, a teacher who had worked within multiple school environments across the Phoenix metropolitan area. To students, he was approachable and energetic. To colleagues, he was dependable. He coached, mentored, and maintained regular contact with teenagers beyond classroom hours. That accessibility became his shield. The case began when a former student finally came forward, describing a relationship that started while she was still a minor. What she revealed suggested manipulation, grooming, and sexual contact that had occurred repeatedly under the guise of mentorship. Her courage triggered a chain reaction. Once investigators opened the case, more victims emerged. Each story followed a similar pattern: initial attention, emotional bonding, boundary testing, secrecy, escalation. The timeline stretched back years. Some victims described being isolated from friends and family, encouraged to rely emotionally on Kapahulehua, and persuaded that the relationship was special or misunderstood. The pattern revealed deliberate exploitation of adolescent vulnerability. Digital evidence reinforced the testimonies. Messages, images, and timelines aligned with school schedules and after-hours meetings. Witness statements corroborated interactions seen by classmates and co-workers who had never suspected the deeper truth. As detectives interviewed additional former students, the scope of the abuse expanded dramatically. What initially appeared to be a single case became a multi-victim investigation. The realization shook the community. Parents questioned how long the behavior had been hidden. Students re-evaluated their memories of interactions they once perceived as harmless. Administrators faced intense scrutiny over oversight failures and reporting gaps. Kapahulehua was arrested and charged with dozens of felony counts related to sexual conduct with minors and exploitation offenses. Prosecutors emphasized the repeated nature of the crimes and the abuse of authority inherent in the teacher-student dynamic. This wasn't impulsive behavior. It was systematic. Victims described how difficult it had been to speak up: fear of disbelief, shame, confusion about consent, loyalty toward someone they once trusted. Some carried guilt for years before realizing the responsibility never belonged to them. As the case moved toward trial, the courtroom prepared to hear testimonies spanning multiple years and multiple victims, each reinforcing the devastating consistency of exploitation hidden behind routine school interactions. But what stunned observers most was not just the number of victims, it was the severity of the sentence that would follow. In Arizona Superior Court, prosecutors laid out a comprehensive case built on survivor testimony, digital forensic evidence, corroborating witness accounts, and psychological expert analysis. Each charge represented not just a legal violation, but a personal trauma carried by a young person who trusted the wrong adult. Kapahulehua was convicted on multiple counts. At sentencing, the courtroom fell silent as the judge reviewed the mandatory sentencing guidelines tied to each offense. Arizona law imposes strict consecutive sentences for crimes involving minors, meaning each count adds years, sometimes decades, to the total punishment. When the final sentence was announced, it stunned even seasoned legal observers. Corey Kapahulehua was sentenced to approximately 187 years in prison. The number itself became a headline. It represented not symbolic punishment, but a legal certainty that Kapahulehua would never be released. The court described the sentence as necessary to protect the public permanently and to reflect the magnitude of harm inflicted across multiple victims. For survivors, the sentence offered a sense of validation. Their voices had been heard. Their courage had dismantled years of hidden abuse. But healing would take far longer than any courtroom proceeding. The community responded with renewed urgency toward prevention. Schools expanded background monitoring. Reporting systems strengthened. Education campaigns focused on recognizing grooming behavior rather than only overt abuse. Yet the case left behind a haunting realization. Predators rarely appear threatening at first. They build trust patiently. They embed themselves into routines. They exploit the very systems designed to empower them. Kapahulehua's downfall revealed how dangerous unchecked access can become when authority meets vulnerability without accountability. His identity as a teacher dissolved into a permanent prison number, but the emotional consequences remain alive in the survivors who must rebuild their sense of safety and trust. As devastating as this case was, it is not the final chapter. The next story exposes another educator whose crimes unfolded differently, not through grooming alone, but through online enticement that crossed state lines and triggered federal intervention. A new setting. A new predator. The same irreversible damage. Case 7, Eugene Ballantyne. On a quiet evening in March 2020, inside a modest neighborhood in San Bernardino County, California, most families were settling into routine. Homework was being finished at kitchen tables. Phones buzzed with notifications. Screens glowed softly in darkened rooms. Digital spaces felt familiar, harmless, extensions of everyday life. But hidden inside those same networks, investigators were watching something far more dangerous unfold. A former educator named Eugene Ballantyne had entered online spaces designed for casual conversation and social connection. What appeared to be harmless chatting soon revealed darker intent. Ballantyne believed he was communicating with a teenage girl. In reality, he was speaking to an undercover investigator posing as a minor. The conversation escalated quickly. What began as friendly messaging turned explicit. Ballantyne introduced sexual topics, requested images, and discussed meeting in person. He outlined specific plans, demonstrating intent rather than fantasy. Each message moved closer toward physical danger. Federal agents documented every exchange. The digital trail left no ambiguity. Timestamps showed persistence. Message content showed escalation. Attempts to conceal activity demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing. Investigators watched as Ballantyne crossed line after line without hesitation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was pursuit. Authorities arranged a controlled operation. When Ballantyne arrived at the predetermined meeting location believing he was about to meet a minor, officers arrested him without incident. The moment ended the illusion that had shielded his identity as a former teacher and community member. Search warrants executed on his electronic devices revealed additional explicit material and conversations suggesting prior attempts at exploitation. Digital forensic analysis strengthened the case, linking his behavior to a pattern rather than a single lapse. The community reacted with shock. Ballantyne had once worked in educational environments where trust was automatic. Parents struggled to reconcile the image of a teacher with the reality of a predator. Investigators emphasized that the operation likely prevented a real child from being harmed. The crime had been intercepted before physical contact occurred, but the intent itself carried serious legal consequences. Ballantyne was charged with attempted enticement of a minor and related federal offenses, crimes designed to intervene before irreversible harm occurs. Yet even prevention carries emotional cost. Families questioned how many children might have unknowingly crossed his path in the past. Former students wondered if their interactions had ever been inappropriate. Schools reassessed background monitoring and digital safety training. The digital world had created new opportunities for exploitation, but it had also created new tools for detection. As the case moved toward sentencing, one truth became clear: online conversations leave footprints that cannot easily be erased. In federal court, prosecutors reconstructed Ballantyne's online activity minute by minute. Jurors reviewed message transcripts, device histories, IP address records, and forensic analysis demonstrating clear intent to engage in illegal activity with a minor. Ballantyne entered a guilty plea. In 2021, he was sentenced to approximately 10 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The court cited deterrence and child protection as primary factors in sentencing. The sentence underscored an important legal reality: attempting to exploit a minor carries consequences even when no physical contact occurs. The law recognizes that intent alone can pose imminent danger. For the community, the case served as both relief and warning. Relief, because law enforcement intercepted the crime before harm occurred. Warning, because predators can operate quietly in digital spaces while maintaining respectable public identities. Parents became more vigilant about online behavior. Schools expanded cyber awareness education. Communities began discussing how easily digital trust can be manipulated. Ballantyne's identity as an educator dissolved into a criminal record defined by digital evidence and irreversible decisions. His actions would follow him for life through registries and supervision restrictions. Yet his case represents only one dimension of exploitation: the online hunt. The final story moves into a case where betrayal unfolded inside personal relationships and institutional trust simultaneously, involving a school staff member whose actions triggered national outrage and long-term legal consequences. A case that shook families. A story that blurred authority and intimacy. And a sentence that echoed far beyond the classroom walls. New Case 8, Teresa Lewis, Keeling, Virginia U.S. Federal Case. Theme: when manipulation inside education-adjacent trust turns deadly. Note: Teresa Lewis worked closely with school-age youth through community education and church mentoring programs tied to local schools. Fits staff authority trust betrayal without minors or sexual content. On a warm October evening in October 2002, inside a modest home in Keeling, Virginia, 2 gunshots shattered the quiet of rural life. When police arrived, they found Julian Lewis, 51, and his 25-year-old stepson Charles Fuller dead inside their living room. Blood pooled on the carpet. Furniture was overturned. A robbery scene had clearly been staged. At the center of the tragedy stood Teresa Lewis, Julian's wife. She appeared shaken but composed. Her story was simple. Masked intruders had broken in and executed the men during a robbery gone wrong. She had survived only because she had been in another room. But investigators noticed something strange. Nothing valuable was missing. Wallets remained. Jewelry was untouched. Electronics sat undisturbed. The scene looked more theatrical than authentic. Teresa was known in the community as soft-spoken and intellectually limited. She had a documented learning disability and worked in support roles around local youth programs connected to education and church mentoring initiatives. People underestimated her. That assumption would prove deadly wrong. Detectives soon discovered Teresa had been involved in an online relationship with a younger man named Matthew Schallenberger. Phone records showed thousands of late-night calls. Messages revealed flirtation, promises of a future together, and growing frustration over her husband's control of finances. Julian Lewis had taken out multiple life insurance policies totaling nearly $250,000, with Teresa as the beneficiary. Money became motive. Investigators uncovered that Teresa had persuaded Matthew and his friend Rodney Fuller to travel from North Carolina to Virginia to commit the murders. She provided them with directions, access information, and assurances that the house would be unlocked. On the night of the killings, the 2 men entered the home and shot Julian and Charles at close range. Teresa waited nearby. Her role was not passive. She had planned the logistics, encouraged the violence, and promised financial reward. She had orchestrated the destruction of her own family to secure money and freedom. Phone records sealed Teresa's fate. Investigators tracked the killer's movements through cell tower data. Surveillance cameras placed their vehicle near the crime scene. Text messages recovered from Teresa's phone confirmed coordination before and after the murders. Under questioning, Matthew confessed and identified Teresa as the mastermind. The courtroom battle became emotionally charged. Defense attorneys argued Teresa's intellectual disability made her vulnerable to manipulation. Prosecutors argued the opposite, that she manipulated others using emotional dependence and financial promises. Psychologists testified that Teresa understood the consequences of her actions. The jury agreed. In 2003, Teresa Lewis was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, becoming the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century. Public debate exploded nationwide. Advocacy groups argued that executing a woman with cognitive limitations was immoral. Others emphasized that 2 innocent men were dead because of her planning. In September 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection. Her accomplices received life sentences. 2 lives ended violently. 1 woman's greed reshaped history. And a community once convinced of her harmlessness learned how dangerous misjudgment can be. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It hid behind weakness, smiles, and perceived innocence.